Hi everybody, my name is Brenna and today I'm going to be talking about social work and genetics. So just kind of getting into it, there are definitely some population differences within the specific subset of social work. The first difference is that you really need to have just a general knowledge of genetic disorders. There are so many different kinds. And just having like a general idea of the different kinds of genetic disorders would be really helpful. Um, in this specific field of social work because you could have clients from completely different who have completely different genetic disorders that need different kinds of support, so having that knowledge is key. And kind of getting into sort of like the sciencey side of things, it is helpful to understand the differences between different genetic disorders, so like single gene where one gene is affected, mutated, um, and an example would be like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. Chromosomal, so where a chromosome is uh, not there at all, or you have an extra one, or just altered in some way. So Down syndrome is a great example of that. And complex, where like two or more genes are mutated or affected. Um, and diabetes is a great example for that, just because you have that gene inherited. But then you also have an environmental factor that triggers it essentially. So, yeah, knowing the nuances of just major genetic disorders is all around very helpful and necessary for this specific field of social work. Definitely not going to get into eugenics and the history of that fully right here, but knowing the history of eugenics, um, and just like how it's sort of seen today, um, especially for folks who have either like disability or in this specific case, like genetic disorder, or parents who have a child with a genetic disorder. That's really necessary to know, because all of that still is very much alive today, um, especially legally and everything, and how folks who have disabilities and more specifically who have like genetic disorders um, are treated. So, and then more specifically, the big issue surrounding non-invasive prenatal testing. So essentially testing to see if the baby has a genetic disorder. Um, there's a big issue around this just because it's not necessary entirely, and it kind of feeds into the idea of this like burden assumption, which is essentially where um, people who have a genetic disorder are a burden to their family and immediate community. And yeah, I mean, this testing is a product of eugenics. So understanding that and how that could affect somebody, um, you know, who has a genetic disorder or is a parent of someone with a genetic disorder, is important. And also, a big thing is social workers are not genetic counselors. Genetic counselors have a completely different background. They have a science background, and they also incorporate some therapeutic intervention. But it's really important to understand the social work role with a specific subset of social work. Um, so knowing like what the social worker is doing. So specifically, social workers a lot of times will have knowledge about like insurance coverage. Um, Maybe clients, helping clients or advocating for clients who are experiencing discrimination because of their genetic disorder. Maybe teaching clients about informed consent, especially if they have like a rare genetic disorder, they might be approached. To see if they, could be a part of a study, and kind of teaching clients like, hey, you have rights, and this is what informed consent looks like for you, is something that a social worker could do, as well as providing therapeutic intervention, when a client is making maybe a big decision regarding their genetic disorder, or maybe parents who have a child with a genetic disorder and need to make a big decision, and kind of helping them through the emotions and everything, as well as figuring out supports, whether like community supports, different resources, um, helping them access care. All those things is what a social worker would do, and genetic counselor has a much more specific role than that, so they are not the same. Moving on to challenges, um, social workers, there can be a few different challenges with this field, but one is helping clients deal with a lot of emotions that they might be experiencing, because there could be, heavy decision making, or, anything regarding their diagnosis, um, having a chronic illness, uh, specifically like a genetic disorder, it can be really emotionally taxing. And so that's a challenge that a social worker is going to have to help a client through, um, as well as just needing to have a good understanding of genetics and a variety of genetic disorders. There are so many, and it can be really overwhelming, especially if you don't really have like a science background. Um, so that's definitely a challenge and could be a big learning curve for folks who are um, trying to work in this specific subset of social work. Some resources needed for social workers, access to information regarding different genetic diseases and disorders, being able to research and figure out what each genetic disorder entails. Obviously, it's going to be different for each client, but just having that general overview is very helpful. Um, Being able to have an understanding of what are some of like the local um, and sort of like resources within the greater area um, that could potentially help your client essentially, and what they could benefit from. So yeah, and then knowledge of laws and insurance information, that's really um, needed. So being able to access information regarding laws, policies, insurance, um, etc., is a great resource that social workers would need. Resources needed for clients. So depending on their genetic disorder, they could need different devices. So maybe like a insulin pump, or like an airway clearance device, etc. Mobility devices, as well as just like different types of care. So maybe they might need a nutritionist or a physical therapist, whatever that looks like. They're going to need that as a resource for them in their care of their regarding the care of their genetic disorder, and having access to various types of care and being able to actually afford that care, because it's very expensive having a chronic illness. Um, and more specifically, like if it's like a rare genetic disorder, they're going to most likely need more supports, and that can be very costly. Um, so yeah, and especially also if they live in a more like rural area and not having access to, um, a good healthcare team, that can be a barrier. So, having that access is key, um, financially and just like physical access. Mental health support for sure, which ties into the different types of care, and then community supports. So being able to have friends, family, folks within the community that can support them and um, help them if they need that kind of help. And then important social work skills that are needed. Empathy, definitely. We as social workers may not have firsthand experience with a specific genetic disorder, uh, that we might come across that our client might have. So being able to really extend that empathy, and which ties into the active listening part as well that I have listed here. Um, Active listening is really important too. Clients are sharing their stories and their experiences, and it's important that we're listening and making them feel heard, and just all around, just really tuning in general. And like I've said before, skill being able to be knowledgeable of, various disorders, resources, policies, being able to be adaptable, depending on, just because like if two of your clients have cystic fibrosis, for example, I mean, even though they have the same genetic disorder, they could have completely different needs. And, it's important to kind of like adapt in that sense of, you know, not treating every client like the same in a sense, but being able to kind of adapt and hone in on what each client needs. So flexibility as well would be included in that. And the ability to learn quickly. You might have to learn on the fly what a specific genetic disorder is and what it could entail. So it's important to be able to learn quickly so that you can meet with your client and support them overall. So yeah, and then I just have some references here and more references. And thank you so much.